Hello and welcome everybody to the episode of Pod Strickland. I'm your host, Shwin, and this is episode 510. I'm joined not by Perez, who's out right now, but I am joined by not a first-time guest. I'm not even a first time in a long time. That is at D Lee for 3. He is the host of Hawks Film Room. David, how you doing?
So, man, I'm good. Looking forward to talking some hoops.
Yeah, well, it's been an active offseason for both of our teams, so we will get into that. Before we do get started, I do have to make a few announcements. First being that the Strickland has a YouTube channel where you may be watching this podcast. If you are not done so already, please like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. That'd be a huge help to us. The Strickland also has merchandise that you can find on our website at www.strict.land. There's a link that's taken to the merchandise store, and there's all kinds of cool stuff on there. Like t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, coffee mugs, water bottles, you name it, we got it. The Strickland also has a Patreon, which you can subscribe to. There are a number of different tiers. There's a $6 tier that gets you access to Pod Strickland, the podcast that I was part of Perez. You also get access to Takes from Obvious Bozos, a podcast hosted by Andrew Steele, a.k.a. Doug, along with Zach Blatter. And you get access to the Strickland Discord where the conversation never stops. There are further tiers. There's a $9 tier that gets you access to Strickland Roll, my solo pod, where I rant and rave with even more. You also get access to wonderful premium articles by Matthew Murno, one of the best in the business. And you get access to Strictly NFL, which you guessed it, is a podcast about the NFL that is hosted by Constantine Metricos and Desmond Novak. There are further tiers. There's a $15 tier, $30 tier, $50 tier, and a $100 tier. That's coming with a variety of additional benefits, like listening to our pod recordings, merchandise discounts, and even potentially hosting a podcast alongside yours truly one day, whether you choose to subscribe or not, and this is possible that you. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll start with the Knicks. They've had I guess you could describe it as an eventful week. Certainly an eventful month. They fired Tom Thibodeau, and just yesterday, I guess they haven't confirmed that they've hired Mike Brown, but all signs are that will get done. They will agree to a contract, and he'll be the next head coach of the New York Knicks. So let's just start there, because I know the last time you were on was, I think it was before even the playoffs started, and I'd come on your show, and then you'd come on ours, and we had talked a bit about Tom Thibodeau and things that I thought, okay, yeah, these are things that he does well, and then it's okay, these are things he doesn't do well, and I don't want to. I'm never gonna pretend that you coach someone for 5 years, you win that many games, you win 4 playoff series, you make an Eastern Conference Finals run. You didn't do a terrible job, and not everything that happened was bad, no matter how much people want to frame it. There are people that frame it that way. I reject that. I also reject the framing of it as, how could you fire Tom Thibodeau? You made the Eastern Conference Finals. This is horrible. What is going on? Everything is a disaster. And I guess I'm just curious, from an outsider's perspective, what did you think of just the initial decision to fire him when they did, which was basically, I want to say it was less than 48 hours after they lost in Game 6 of the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yeah, I think and I kind of defer to Knicks fans when it comes to stuff like this. So, I love Shaq stuff, I love Presidente stuff that you say as well. It really helps inform what I'm watching. But from my perspective as an outsider, it was that Knicks team was never maximized offensively. And if it's not going to be maximized offensively, they're an offensively slanted team, then you got to bring in someone who can do that. And I do think to an extent that can happen with an assistant coach. But I think there's probably a feeling in the organization that they had reached their ceiling with Tibs as a coach, even if he did overachieve initially with those first Knicks teams, those Randall Elfrid Payton units that had no business being the 4th seed. He's one of the best floor raisers in the sport. But I think when it came to, okay, how can we take this team to the next level, which is we actually need to be contending, then I think a lot of those questions about, is he a viable enough offensive option? Is he inventive enough? Is he creative enough? Is he flexible enough? Is he malleable enough? Is he versatile? And I think that's really came down to that, because it's there were so few sort of levers he pressed to try and make the roster a little bit more conducive. So I think it was justified, but I can also understand why someone would be okay, coaches are always the scapegoat, right? There are other things that happen throughout the season, Cat's defensive intensity. It could be, the overall lack of movement within the offense. The fact they gave up 5 picks for someone who isn't necessarily a great self-creator. So it's all these other things that stack on top of it. And the team itself wasn't that deep. I started playing Deuce McBride more. That bench was pretty apathetic. So I can understand why he put so much trust into his starters, but I do think it took him too long to adjust. By the time he got to Game 4 against Indiana, he finally adjusted. It's these lineups, he played lineups that hadn't seen the floor all season for the first time in a winner-go-home game. And that should tell you all you need to know about his lack of experimentation, the lack of malleability, lack of versatility. I think I can understand why that would frustrate. As a lead decision maker out, whether you're in the front office or in the ownership, I can understand why that'd be frustrating. So I think it was justified.
Yeah. I think what I actually find pretty interesting is, so they go through this whole process of like this extended coaching search, and obviously they end up hiring Mike Brown. But if you look at most of the people they were linked with, the people they requested to interview, even, right? Finch, I think he's gotten a lot of credit for offensive creativity. To me, he's more of a defensive guy. I think Jason Kidd is 100% way more of a defensive mind than an offensive one. Billy Donovan, to me, like, I know that they did a lot of cool stuff in terms of like moving, like playing fast, but I always think like his best work is coming maximizing whatever the fuck Chicago gives him on the defensive end of the floor. Aside from Quinn Snyder, who, again, like, I think you request these things. I don't think they really expected to get approval on any of them. Maybe Billy Donovan. They thought that maybe to get a chance. And maybe Jason Kidd, just because they thought maybe Jason Kidd will throw up a stink and try to get out, because that's what Jason Kidd does. But like, if you kind of go through that, right, and then you go to Mike Brown, more of a defensive guy. Taylor Jenkins, more of a defensive mind. I think there's a common thread there. And what I think is also interesting about the eventual selection of Mike Brown is Mike Brown's actually like not like, he's very personable, and he's definitely more gregarious. I think he's more of like I think he connects better probably with people, and he's just more personable than Tibs is. But he is more of like an old school coach. Like, this is a guy who comes from, he made his bones coaching under Greg Popovich and Rick Carlisle early in his career as an assistant coach. Like, he's not, one of these new wave guys who has been like, came up in the late 2010s and it's like all about like immediately his entire knowledge of basketball is like, got to get up more threes, got to play fast. Like, it's a different thing. But I find it interesting they landed on him. And like you mentioned, maybe you could have brought in an offensive coordinator type of coach for Thibodeau. But one thing that was kind of talked about today, Fred Katz released a piece, whereas it was kind of like Tibbs is very, very different from most coaches in the NBA, where it's like he coaches, he's in charge of everything. Like, he does not delegate that stuff. He is in charge of the offensive scheme. He is in charge of the defensive scheme. And like, this has been talked about. If you watch the Knicks games, like when they call timeout, he doesn't really like huddle with his coaches in a way that most coaches do. Like, it's his show. And while Mike Brown, I think, has a lot of the same characteristics and traits and strengths as a coach in terms of his defensive kind of acumen, the fact that we know for a fact, like, he did let Yordi Fernandez kind of like run the show offensively in Sacramento. And I think the fact that we've had reports of like, okay, the Knicks are going to try to go after James Borrego to kind of be their offensive coordinator. I think that speaks to what the fundamental issues were, where it was, I don't know that it was actually like maybe a yes, we know they want, of course anybody would be like, yeah, we would like you to mix your lineups up more and try more stuff in the regular season. But I think at the fundamental core of it, like the through line and all of it is, can you adapt, and can you like let other people help you? Can you let other people be part of the solution instead of feeling like it's all on you to do everything? And maybe they had that conversation with Tibbs at the end of the season. In fact, I suspect they might have had that conversation with Tibbs. And if he was not kind of on board with that, like, for me, it just, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter to me when they fired Tibbs if they didn't have we know this guy is the guy that we want and we're going to go get him right now. I think it's okay, because once you fundamentally, like, once there's a fundamental disagreement at that high of a level where you're like, we just don't see eye to eye anymore, and we don't believe that the way this man operates is going to get us to the top or give us the best chance to get to the top, you have to separate. You have, and Prez, we talked about this like right after it happened, and he brought up a good point too, where it was like, a couple years ago, you might have felt the same way, but you also might have looked at the roster and been like, we don't actually have the talent right now to hold him to that standard, where it's like, we're trying to win a championship, where it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, look at the team. Like, there's no chance we can win a championship. And I think that has changed now. The stakes are higher. The talent level is higher. You've pushed in your chips in a big way to assemble this roster. So I think you have less time to fuck around and waste seasons, because you're like, well, we got to the second round. That's good. Like, No, I think it's a different standard now. And if you just look at what the Knicks did in the postseason, just if you look at the bare results, you would just look at it on paper and be like, yeah, that's a pretty solid season. Like, why would you fire this coach? But I mean, you watch them in the playoffs. Everybody watched them in the playoffs because that's what we do. We're all basketball sickos. I
Right.
think it's safe to say that, like, if you ran back that postseason 100 times, how many times did the Knicks make it to Game 6 of the Eastern Conference Finals? Like 10? Less? I think less. Like, you just look at the first two games of the Boston series, and I mean, I don't know how many times you come, like, that's never been done before. Fact. Like, two 20-point comebacks on the road in a series to start it on the road back to back. And then they had a third
Right.
20-point comeback on the road in Game 3 against the Pacers. And it's like, those are great. They show you the talent you have. They show you that this group didn't quit on him, which is a credit to Thibodeau as well. And it's a credit to the players that they kept fighting. But if you keep going into those holes, that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
I
think it's not to cut you off, but I think it's interesting, and I am somewhat. So I had a whole like argument in my group chat. We were trying to say like, okay, is Mike Brown an offensive or defensive minded coach at this point? And my argument was, okay, he is a defensive minded coach by reputation, right? What he did in the beginning of his career, but I don't think he's defined by what he was prior to those Golden State tenures as an assistant. And by 100%, I think he had a lot of influence from Steve Kerr. But I think your point about letting the assistant lean into the areas where you're not as proficient is really, really, really important. Because if Tibbs had that same mindset, and again, I don't know if he really did or didn't. I don't know if he trusted his assistants. I don't know if his assistants were as capable as someone like Jordy Fernandez. But like that's the determining factor about, because we know what Tibbs brings in terms of like getting a locker room to buy in, the defensive integrity. Like he's really good at stuff like that. And so I had that whole debate. My argument was, okay, Mike Brown is not just a defensive minded coach at this point in his career because of what he was able to adjust to in Sacramento. Before he came to Sacramento, 3 of the 6 teams he coached prior to that were in the bottom 10 in pace. And then now all of a sudden Sacramento's the number 1 offense. They're getting out on the 3rd highest rate in the league. Like they were a completely different type of offense than he had ever ran before. And maybe that was Jordy, but I also think some of that needs to be attributed to Mike Brown, being able to say, okay, and even if that was entirely Jordy, I would also imagine that Mike Brown has picked up on some things that he can bring to New York. So was he your favorite candidate? I'm just curious. Or did you have someone else you would prefer?
I mean, like favorite candidate of the guys they actually interviewed, I think the guy I probably like, and I can't speak to it because he's never had a head coaching job, but I kind of would have liked to see them roll the dice on Mike Inori. But I am also of the opinion that like, so I've always liked Mike Brown, just like cards on the table. Like I've always thought, I think he got fired in Cleveland the first time around purely because they were like desperately trying to keep LeBron. It had nothing to do with him. I think the Lakers job that he took over was a poison chalice. You're taking over for Phil Jackson, like at the end of like this kind of that core of players run. That was never going to happen. He shouldn't have ever gone back to Cleveland. That was just a disaster situation. That was a mess. And then he goes to Sacramento. He has success. He's not the perfect coach, but he's had a lot of success. He's at just under a 600 win percentage. It's literally 599. So if he wins his first game in New York, he'll be above 600. Like he's a very, very successful regular season coach. He actually has a 50-40 record in the postseason. So he's got a winning postseason record as well. He's been to a finals, he's been to multiple conference finals. Like he's not, and he's a 2-time coach of the year. Like I've always just felt like he is a guy who has, his reputation should be better than it is. Like if you view Tibbs in a certain way, as far as I'm concerned, you should at least accord Mike Brown the same level of respect. They are to me at least in the minimum in the same tier of coach. So I was okay with Mike Brown, and you touched upon with the Jordy Fernandez thing. Even if we want to say like you mentioned, like let's just say he gets through the keys to Jordy and was like, "That's all you, go for it." He still had to sign off on hiring Jordy, and he clearly must have liked the kind of vision that Jordy was going to bring to the table, which obviously we know in his time in Golden State in terms of like playing fast, a lot of ball movement, a lot of player movement, a lot of big at the high post, big at the elbows, dribble handoff type of stuff. Like these are things that he was probably familiarized and comfortable with coming from Golden State. So even if he maybe doesn't have the full kind of like institutional knowledge to install the entirety of that offense, it's definitely something he's comfortable with. And it's something that, like you mentioned, it was definitely not in his bag when he was in Cleveland the first 2 times, or even the first time with the Lakers where they ran more of like a like Princeton style offense. That was a totally different era, and he was running with like, they had Odom, they had Gasol, they had Bynum, so they had to play double big. Like, you're running a totally different thing there. But it all speaks to a guy who has shown a lot of flexibility, I think, throughout his career, and flexibility in ways that I don't think Tibs, like, I do think Tibs is a little bit more flexible in terms of just adjusting to like you're not a good coach in 2010 and a good coach in 2025 without with being like zero flexibility. That's not possible. You cannot just be the same coach. So I think Tibs was more flexible than people gave him credit for, but he was not flexible about certain things. It's like he had to have a true center on the floor at all times. Like, there was just some things he was incapable of being flexible about. And if you kind of look at the work I think Mike Brown's done in his career, and specifically, like you mentioned, the stuff with the Kings, I mean, this is a man who gave fucking Trey Lyles legit run at the 5 against Golden State in the playoff series. Like that would never happen with Thibodeau. It would just never happen unless you're down 12 with maybe 2 minutes left and you're just throwing whatever you can at the wall. So, again, like, I don't think that they wanted like a massive philosophical shift in the sense of, we want a guy who is the opposite of Tibs in every way. One of the things I found interesting is, a lot of Kings fans are upset with Mike Brown the last kind of year or so, and a lot of it stemmed from he wouldn't play Keon Ellis more. And I like Keon Ellis, and I think Keon Ellis should have played more, but part of the frustration he had with Keon Ellis is that Keon Ellis is prone to freelancing off of scheme defensively. So he gambles, steals, he does those kind of things. And that was just, that's just a pet peeve for Mike Brown. And so he would, restrict his minutes accordingly because of that. And I think that's interesting because that's exactly the type of thing where if you're Thibodeau, he can deal with you fucking up. What he cannot deal with is stuff like that, where he's like, you're doing something that's the opposite of the entire scheme. Like, I don't want you to deviate. I can deal with you messing up. I can't deal with you trying to play outside of the scheme. And I think that kind of speaks to, they were okay with that piece of it, but they wanted more from the other elements, like maybe like more flexibility with changing up how you approach schematic, like your offensive scheme and stuff like that. Because I do think, I know Tibbs never played his zone defensively, but I actually thought this was the most creative he was defensively in the postseason I saw ever. Like we saw him switch all the time against Boston, which I've never seen him do. So yeah, like, it was wild watching. I was like, within the first 5 minutes of game 1, I was like, wait, are they switching? Is that what's happening here? But yeah, so I was happy with them. I'm happy with the Mike Brown hire, contingent on what the staff hires look like, because I don't think this is a guy, and honestly, in 2025, with the level of complexity and detail that every team kind of puts into their preparation, it's just too much for one guy to be in charge of like the whole show, as far as I'm concerned. So, if they had kept Tibbs, I was saying it then, you've got to get an offensive coordinator on staff. And, obviously I feel the same way now, where it's like, get the guy, pay, like, there's no salary cap on coaching. So go get the best assistants you can get, fill out the staff the best way you can get it, and let's see what happens. But as it stands, like, the coaching side of it, I'm fine with. The player side of it, I'm curious to get your thoughts. So the Knicks did do a couple of small pieces of business so far. Jordan Clarkson gets bought out by the Utah Jazz. He left exactly $3.6 million on the table, which is the exact amount that is veterans minimum, that the Knicks will pay him on the veterans minimum next year. And then they also signed Gershon Yabusele, 2 years. Right now it's being reported as it's at the full taxpayer mid-level exception. I suspect it might come in slightly cheaper than that, so the Knicks can add one more experienced vet to the roster. We'll see. But yeah, let's just start with Clarkson, because I know when you had come on before, you talked a little bit previously that you were like, hey, look, like I think there's more stuff that Tibs could do with Mikal Bridges in terms of putting in pick and rolls, but this team just doesn't have that much shot creation. Like how do you feel about Jordan Clarkson, who has been very streaky through his career, but certainly brings that element of it? How do you feel about that signing for the Knicks?
Yeah, I think I'm not even gonna lie to you and say I've been locked in on the Jazz, over the last couple of years. But what I do know, like from what the numbers have told me in the few
Danny
games that
Ainge
I've
hasn't been
caught.
locked into the Jazz either.
Oh yeah, for sure. But I mean, from the numbers and like the very little games that I've watched, right? He's still a very gifted creator for himself. I think there's kind of like a big debate among teams that have a superstar, okay, and it's typically guards, but like the whole backup point guard stuff really drives me crazy because I put out a whole tweet about it. Hawks fans are obsessed with the idea of a backup point guard. They want us to go get a backup point guard. Okay. And then my sort of rebuttal is, okay, well, look at the contingent of secondary ball handlers we have on the roster. We have Luke Kennard. We have Nickeil Alexander-Walker. We have Dyson Daniels. We have Jalen Johnson. Tell me which veteran guard we should go sign right now who's available in free agency, who's better than those four guys, but also is willing to play 10 minutes a night. And so for someone like Jalen Brunson, he's also going to be playing 36 minutes a night. You're not going to sign someone you're not going to spend a lot of money on someone to play that role. I think Jordan Clarkson on vet min is completely fine. He could maybe play with Brunson from time to time too if you have the double bigs. He's played off the ball. He's played on the ball. And I really love guys who have that malleability in terms of their role. And I think he's someone who could run the bench offense a lot and have more trust in someone like Cam Payne, who's a lot more volatile, also a smaller guy. I think where it might get a little dicey with Jordan Clarkson is just like, the defense, of course, sometimes he can kind of go off script offensively, but like I don't really think there's a question about his talent or his shot creation ability. Sometimes it's just more so about like, is he converting them? But I mean, he was in the 10th, he's in the 91st percentile in like isolation or creation looks, and that was for the last 3 years, right? So he's right above league average there. So I think in a system where he's not going to be asked to do so much and he can play a little bit more off the ball, and he can sort of spell Brunson in terms of shortening that offensive load. He makes a lot of sense. I like Yabusele a lot too because I think he'll get out and run. He's a big body. He gives you the ability to play a big with Cat who isn't going to crunch the floor because he is 6'8", but he also plays bigger than that because of his size and his frame. So I think it's a very interesting, Russ. I think what I've got to see what the rest of everything else is because like I think it's a very, very good top 8. Top 8. And then after that, I'm like, I don't know. But again, in the playoffs, as much as depth does matter, like OKC and Indiana both showed that because the pace is up. Guys are getting tired. You have to have stamina. You have to have guys who could rotate in and out. I still think the playoffs is about your top 8 or 9 versus your top 11, top 12. But in the regular season, you definitely would want a little bit more behind those guys. But yeah, I was a fan of the signing so far.